I can see it in your eyes, I can see it in your smile. You're all I've ever wanted, and my arms are open wide. 'Cause you know just what to say, and you know just what to do. And I want to tell you so much, I love you.
Back again. This is Word of Info, and today we're pleased to have with us Dr. Martin Bomas, Egyptology, reader in Egyptology at the University of Birmingham, creator of the Ethan Myers Collection, director of Qubbat al-Hawa Research Project, and editor of the Journal of the Egyptian Archaeology, and Dr. Iman Khalifa, lecturer of Egyptology and Egyptologist at Cairo University.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's really great to have two very well-known Egyptologists, and we will take some time to discuss with everyone about the great accomplishments that they have done through a really fascinating and a very impressive career. We should always start with ladies first, but since you are the guest here, sir, you're coming to Egypt as our distinguished guest. We're going to excuse us from Dr. Iman to allow us to talk with our guest. Then we'll talk with our very valuable distinguished Egyptologist, Dr. Iman, about a lot of things that we really want to share with our listeners about Egyptology and about Egypt, but most of all of us don't really know. So let's start first with Dr. Bomas about something which is really very interesting. As we were discussing off air now a few minutes ago, you are a real good example of a European or citizen of Europe, because you were born in Germany, took your primary education and the university degree from Heidelberg in Germany, and then had more studies done in Netherlands, worked in Basel in Switzerland, in Italy, and then ended up your career becoming a reader. By the way, reader means equivalent to an associate professor in the American universities, which is a very distinguished career, going into the path of a real full professor or a chair professor or a chairperson. And of course, doing also some sabbatical, and now working in Paul Getty Foundation in United States of America. So all this gives you the title of citizen of Europe, or even citizen of the world, right? How did it start? I mean, you in the beginning, as a young student in the school in Germany, how as a start Egypt attracted your attention?
Actually, it started out because I wanted to see the world, and I always thought that if I can get a job or a profession that would bring me out to the world and meet other people in foreign countries, this would be the job I would really love to do. I had an interest in history when I was at school, but I had so many other interests at that time. I loved music, I was playing the piano, the guitar, I was interested in art, photography, fashion. I found it really hard to decide which profession I wanted to take on in the end. And because I was so undecided, I went to the University of Heidelberg and said, what do you have that could attract me? And of course they said, well, that's the wrong question. You come to us and you need to know what you want. I said, I just don't know. And they said, okay, this is the catalog of all our subjects. Choose what you want. And that, because I didn't know, I started with A. Archaeology, Assyriology, and Egyptology, which is written with an A in German. And this is how I started. And one day I went to the Egyptological Institute and I thought, let's find out what these guys are doing, whether it's of any interest for me. And this is how I met Professor Jan Assmann, who, as most people would agree with me, is the most prolific Egyptologist in the world, who opened Egyptology to cultural studies and did a lot of projects in Egypt as well, but also is a philologist working with texts. And within the first 2 hours of meeting this grand person, I thought, I don't want to do anything else in my life but being an Egyptologist and trying to be in touch with proper artifacts in this country, not only museums. And this is when I had an interest for the first time in Egypt. But I was lucky enough during my early years as a student to really come to Egypt and see at face value what this country has to offer. It wasn't that straight, because first I had to become an archaeologist, because already in this time you cannot just go to Egypt and dig. You have to be qualified in order to do that, and this was already the case in 1989. So I went to Pakistan for a couple of months and learned how to excavate and how to work. And then when I arrived in Egypt, I just thought, this is the place for me. And I never looked back. I was 23 years old, and I'm still around, and I've seen some miles in this country. I see the country develop in a very, I think, important period of time between 89 and today, 2016 still. So I saw it change in Egypt, but I also saw change in myself, and this is what Egypt gave to me as a person. It's not just that I came there to work and then go home. There's always something you take away from a country that is so different from what you get in Europe, a country that you love, but not only for the beautiful things, but also for all its imperfections. Like every country, Egypt has a lot of imperfections, but you grow into these, and you start understanding it and try to get a feel for the place that is so important for me. So Egypt was always part of my life. So most, let's say, more than half of my time I have also spent in Egypt, and that included periods where I worked in Aswan for up to 8 months in one go. And because I was very young, 23 at that age, that had an impact on me.
So when we talk about that, it attracts our attention, the word Germany, because actually a friend of mine, I consider him as a friend, but definitely he was in a very high caliber professor who I met in the early 70s, and his name is Professor Ahmed Badawi. Professor Ahmed Badawi himself was already the director of Cairo University, the director of Ain Shams University, and the director of the Organization of Antiquity, and at the same time the holder of a PhD and a doctorate, state doctorate in archaeology from Germany in the 30s. So when we look back at this period, how the German Egyptologists had their impact not only on the Egyptology as a start, but also on the science of Egyptology and in the dedication of a lot of Egyptian archaeologists. Do you think that this dates to the early 20th century with the fascination of our beloved Queen Nefertiti? Or do you think that it goes even further in the 19th century, the idea of how the Egyptologists of Germany had an impact on the whole branch as a whole?
I think there's one thing we have to understand here. Egypt at the beginning of the 20th century was a very different place. The archaeology was carried out by the French and the British. And because, British and German, foreign ministers did not always agree. They were, they were not really friends, to put it mildly. The Germans had no say in Egypt. The Germans had no access to Egypt, and this is why Germans very wisely turned into philology. They were text specialists. So while the French were mostly working in Egypt as archaeologists, and the British as well, and developed archaeology in Egypt to a very high level, the Germans were still sitting at home reading texts. And this kind of changed with a person like Ludwig Borchardt, the gentleman you just mentioned, who started the presence of German Egyptology in Egypt with Tel El Amarna, a place that was first excavated by Flinders Petrie, the British, but then the Germans took over. And it's interesting that you mentioned Nefertiti, because right at the start of his career in Egypt, the Nefertiti accident happened, and he took the statue, the bust of Nefertiti, back to Germany, where it actually leads a very interesting life. Nefertiti is not just a statue for the Germans, it's part of their culture. You find Nefertiti on German stamps. Well, you find it also on Egyptian stamps, but like the Elgin marbles that once belonged to the Parthenon in Athens and are now in London in the British Museum, Nefertiti has become someone an icon, and she lives in Berlin. She is a dweller of Berlin. You could give her a passport and they would say, well, lives in Berlin. She's become a Berliner. And I think that makes her stand out. And nowadays, we live in a world where, we all deal with computers, and images are easily accessible, and even three-dimensional images are accessible. It doesn't really matter so much where things are. It's important that we find things and we have access to those things. I think that's a responsibility that we all have as archaeologists, to be open to the world and give freely. But it doesn't mean that objects have to be at a certain place to be appreciated.
So, Nefertiti had her print on the Egyptologist of Germany. They found that it has attracted a lot of young, enthusiastic Germans like you to the field of archaeology. So Iman has told me before we went on air that you were the youngest director of the excavation in a very important area, and now you are revisiting this area again. So tell us about this in particular, because when we talked about Elephantine Island, we have to give just an introduction to our listeners where this island rests and how important is it in the memory of Egypt and in the fate of Egypt.
Let me first tell you something about what Dr. Iman said about me being, the man in Elephantine. That only happened because of the Kuwait War. The Kuwait War was looming, and foreign nationals were not allowed into Egypt anymore, and I was still in Elephantine. And this meant that I was the one who had access to it, started excavations. I had 70 workmen. I needed to make them happy, but just could not send them home because there was a Kuwait War. Elephantine is a very remarkable place for many reasons. First, it's the longest continuously inhabited place in Egypt. From pre-dynastic periods until today, people live there, and they all have left their mark on Elephantine. This is the most important thing. Another very important aspect about Elephantine is its strategic location at the very southern tip of Egypt. Egypt at that point, not only mythically but also geographically, was the southern end of Egypt. This is where Egypt started. Everything else south of Egypt, of Elephantine, was just Africa, Nubia, a distant land for the Egyptians. So everyone who wanted to enter Egypt from the south had to pass by Elephantine. Elephantine is an island in the middle of the Nile, one of the most beautiful places one can imagine, but it's also a very well protected area. If you want to protect yourself from others, from incoming cultures, or you want to protect your own things that you took from incoming cultures, then of course an island is the best thing to have. But in order to make it even better, the ancient Egyptians at that point did not only content themselves with an island, they made sure no one is living there on this island. It's only administration. And also they built a fortress. So everyone coming from Africa, everyone entering Egypt, the first thing this person would have seen is a stronghold, a mighty Egypt with a mighty fortress that is invincible and you cannot get inside. But this fortress obviously, was meant to hold goods, export and import. That was the talk of the town already in pre-dynastic Egypt, and Elephantine helped safeguarding the economic power of Egypt at a very early age. So the Egyptians are very clever. They thought everything who's coming in, everything that's getting out, has to pay taxes. It's important that economy thrives. And in order to make that sure, you have to protect your borders. And this is what happened at the very earliest history in Egypt in Elephantine, but also at the other important fortress in the north of the country in Memphis. These were the borders of Egypt. The border was not the Mediterranean, it was Memphis.
We'll talk about that with Dr. Iman later, but since we are in Elephantine, we have to say something, that people who were living near Elephantine, or the distinguished people, or the governor and the entourage that was surrounding him, and the people who served him, and all these people who were around Elephantine definitely had a very important place in the society, and they were looked up on by the rest of the population as influential people. So this is perhaps why Elephantine and the area around it has definitely a very important traces of the people who lived there. It has cemeteries, it has places that we call like Obat al-Hawa, where there are a lot of cemeteries that belong to ancient Egypt and the Old Kingdom. So this perhaps is driving us again to Obat al-Hawa 2016 and before then in Obat al-Hawa and Elephantine in 1989. Let's go in between, because this would actually form the career of Dr. Boma in Egypt.
Yeah, this is interesting because when I started working in Elephantine, I was excavating a settlement dating to roughly 2000 before Christ, so 4,000 years from today. And I excavated the lives of the people. I knew where their bathroom was, and I knew that they lived together with their cattle, because cattle out at night is not a good thing. Someone might steal it. So in your bedroom, you kept your cattle, your goats and your sheep, which sounds a bit funny today. But yeah, you had a warm place. I mean, a place without a heating, well, if you have no heating or sheep, you would probably prefer sheep. That's what they thought in Elephantine. So they lived a life that we can track down.
And imagine, right?
Yes, exactly. And you can track down now with the methods of modern archaeology to each and every detail. We know how they lived, we know how they built refrigerators, we know how they organized their lives, how they built ovens and, you know, kitchens and everything. But at that point, when we excavated the settlement of the First Intermediate Period and Middle Kingdom Egypt, we of course knew that those people who lived in Elephantine were buried at the Kubel Hawa, which is just 5 kilometers to the north on the western side of the Nile. But the problem with the Kubel Hawa is that there the posh people were buried, you know, the bigwigs, people like, you mentioned it, the governors of Elephantine, who were into trading, who organized the export of goods, but even more so the import of goods into Egypt, the ones who were interested in taxes. Those were the rich people, and the rich people had very classy and posh rock-cut tombs at the highest point of Kubel Hawa, one tomb next to the other, very splendidly worked out. But the problem is that the normal people that we really excavated or tried to find or track down in Elephantine, the middle class, is missing in the Kubel Hawa. It's really hard to find the middle class. So we have the posh people, the governors. We have the poorest people, those who did not even make it into a cemetery, but who were buried within abundant houses with very, very, modest burials. But where's the middle class? And that is something I always wanted to look into when I was a student, but even now more so, by trying to track down the middle class in the area of Aswan. And this is not possible because at Kubel Hawa we found an area that has never been excavated before. It has never been touched. It's covered with desert sand, with rubble, and no one really wants to go there and work because you have to remove at least 3 meters of rubble before you get into the monuments. But this is exactly what we do. And in this area we found a causeway, a Middle Kingdom causeway leading up to an area which looks like a second terrace, a very expensive infrastructure with streets and so on. No one would invest so much money in a causeway if they had not wanted access to tombs, for instance. And we also started excavating a Middle Kingdom mastaba necropolis at the foot of the hill. The foot of the Kubel Hawa has never been excavated before. We are the first. And we are able to get our teeth into Middle Kingdom evidence. And this is really important because the Middle Kingdom changed dramatically the face of Elephantine, new policies being in place. Elephantine, Egypt as a whole was reinvented during the time of Senwosret I. But now we have the possibility to compare the world of the living with the world of the dead. And there are not too many places in Egypt where you can do that. Beni Hassan, you have a necropolis, Bershe, you have but where's the settlement? In the first Upper Egyptian nome, the area known as Aswan area nowadays has both settlements and necropolis. This is just the jackpot in Egyptian archaeology.
Well, I love the expression of "we are getting our teeth on it" by Dr. Martin Bourmouth, talking about Egyptology, and definitely very interesting stuff, and changing the stones into flesh and blood.
Yes, exactly.
More after the break.
Yes.
Now you say you're lonely. You cry the whole night through. Well, you can cry me a river, cry me a river. I cried a river over you. And now you say you're sorry for being so untrue. Well, you can cry me a river, cry me a river, 'cause I cried a river over you. You drove me nearly out of my head, while you never shed a tear, babe. Remember, I remember all that you said. You told me love was too plebeian, told me you were through with me, and now you say you love me. Well, just to prove that you do, why don't you cry me a river? Cry me a river, 'cause I cry a river over you, over you. You say you love me, but you lie. Well, just to prove that you do, come on and cry me a river. Oh, cry me a river. I cried a river over you. I cried a river over you.
So, after the break, we're talking again with Dr. Martin Bolmes and Dr. Iman Khalifa. Dr. Iman, you are a lecturer of Egyptology in the Faculty of Archaeology in Cairo University, and I know, because you're a dear friend to us, that you have had a master's degree and PhD degree from Tulane University in New Orleans, which is a very prestigious university, and you are the only specialized person in a certain branch and a field that we really would love the listeners to hear about. Please.
Well, they call it ceramology. If you want to sound spiffy, it's just the study of pottery. Mm-hmm. And if you just look around you, you'll find many things that are made of pottery these days. You got the pots, the jeans, for example, when we want to cook at home. The tiles. We have so many things that we don't use that are just aesthetically beautiful, like the vases, all of these things, Chinaware that we eat in. Same thing was in ancient times. In ancient Egypt, especially the fact that they did not have other aspects, other things like plastic that we have today. It was mainly pottery, fired clay that they used for many things in their daily life. And it also made its way into the other life, the afterlife, into tombs. And because we use pottery for everything today, and they did the same, if we look at pottery, we can interpret or read the daily life of ancient Egyptians. What they did, what they ate. If we just look at the pot itself, the style, we can date the area. If we have, for example, a tomb. And this works best if we're looking at a settlement, we're excavating a settlement, or if we're excavating a site that is pre-dynastic, because we do not have texts that tell us what was going on.
Pre-dynastic period is your specialty before you went to Tulane,
Yeah.
and afterwards. And this is really a very important question. I mean, you have dedicated a lot of your career and your life to scriptless lives of the Egyptians, where the handwriting and the writing and the calligraphy and everything was not there, and yet you are trying to build up the characters and to try to imagine the life of these Egyptians who were living in the pre-dynastic period, and this is really a very big challenge. How were you able to pick that at the start? Because really it's very interesting, because always in the beginnings you can understand a lot of the lives of the persons in front of you. Right.
Well, one thing that helped me is that I worked in the Western Desert, where preservation is phenomenal. And the site I worked at dates to as early as 10,000 years ago. And this is where the oldest pottery, not only in Egypt, but also in Africa, was invented.
And perhaps in the whole world, right?
No, the whole world was a little bit earlier, but in Africa, almost 10,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians of that time, before they went to the Nile Valley, they were living in the desert. The Nile Valley was not a place where ancient Egyptians wanted to live in the beginning. Egypt was not a desert like it is today. Egypt was a tropical area. So the Nile Valley had too much water. It had too many dangerous animals. The Egyptians wanted to live somewhere where it's safe. The desert, because it has 3 months of rain in the summer, like any tropical area, it had enough big lakes forming there, where the ancient Egyptians lived around it, starting from 10,000 years ago, until the final desiccation came, the final hyper-arid period came, almost around the beginning, shortly before the beginning of ancient Egyptian history. And this is when ancient Egyptians moved to the Nile Valley, and we're still living here until today, because we have not had any rain since then, hardly any rain since then.
So when we're talking about that, to make our listeners understand what you are talking about, is that when you go into the Egyptian Museum on the first floor, just after leaving the mummy's room, the famous mummy's room where everybody is visiting, you'll find a very beautiful room that has some 5 or 6 stairs leading you to the unknown, the pre-dynastic period, with a lot of beautiful pottery that is always attracting the attention of the caregiver or the care-interested visitors of the Egyptian Museum, right? To make this approaching and appealing to our listeners, right?
Exactly, that's what it is, and it's as simple as if it's pre-dynastic, it's before dynasties, it's before what we call Mina, the person who we know in Egypt today as Mina. Well, the king who unified Egypt came, and so anything before the beginning of dynasties, that's the pre-dynastic period.
So before we leave you now, we have to talk about the collaboration that's going between you as a ceremologist, right? Who's very much interested into pottery, and the work that you're doing with Dr. Bomas about this, and about how you're both cooperating on giving a picture of the Ubat al-Hawa and the Elephantine. Right? Tell us about that, please.
As I said before, if you want to understand a necropolis, a cemetery, a place where people were buried, it's always a fantastic opportunity to understand settlements. They both work in hand, and as I said before, Aswan is the best region to study that. But pottery indeed is one of the most important study areas in any excavation, and that allows you to understand how people lived and how you date some certain areas. Without a pottery specialist, you cannot excavate. It's just not possible.
Nobody can live without Iman, definitely.
Yeah, but what makes Iman so special is that she also works on Elephantine, and she also studied Middle Kingdom pottery. As a matter of fact, she worked on pots that I excavated in my young days. She studied these pots in later years. So she knows the material from Elephantine. Whenever there's a pot in Kubel-Hawa or shirt that we excavate, she can compare it to the material she knows from the other side of the Nile. This is just a fantastic opportunity. Actually, the best pottery specialist one can dream of. But there's also another thing which I even find more exciting, and that is something I do not know anything about. Perhaps we should ask ask her, which is modern technologies like residue analysis. Pottery specialists nowadays do really exciting things, and this is what Dr. Iman can do and probably tell us more about.
This is the part that you try to involve some people of our atomic energy experts, right?
Yes.
A relative of mine and a friend who you met, and you're going to start a combined research in trying to find the exact age, or using the carbon, the radioactive carbon, or what's your preferable technique?
Well, the technique we use, we try to identify what the pot was used for. It's a technique that they use in CSI. You probably hear about it a lot if you watch CSI.
Yes.
But don't take what they say for true, for granted.
I'm sure.
Because they do fancy things that do not happen in real life just because it's TV.
I mean, it's TV, it's showtime, show business.
Exactly. But what it does is that everything that has a fabric, and pottery has a fabric because it's like a dough, everything that has a fabric absorbs whatever it
was used for, yes.
Exactly. And what is absorbed can stay on the surface or can get absorbed within the fabric and cannot be changed. And in a desert area like Egypt, there's hardly any reason for it to be washed away by water because there's no rain. So over thousands of years, whatever that was in the pot, remains of it stays within the fabric of the pot, even if it itself disappeared or evaporated. So we use the technique to extract what was in the pores. We get away of the pores themselves. We get away of the pot by filtering it, and whatever was left, we don't see it by the eye, but we inject it into a machine called GC, and the other one is MS, so gas chromatography mass spectrometry, and it tells us each compound, and we go and look what these compounds were used for in the past, and voila, then we're able to identify what the pot was used for. For example, I worked on a pottery that were 5,000 years old. They are stored at the British Museum. They come from Heraclius, a very important pre-dynastic center. At that time, the pots, they look normal. They have different kinds, different forms. And I identified that they were used for cooking, generally for cooking. And it seems that there's a trend that some forms were used for cooking vegetables, and other forms were used more commonly for cooking meat. If we can carry on with that, we'll see if this is a trend that was all over Egypt. Was that different from one place to the next? And then we're able to identify what these different forms of pottery were used for. The same thing can be applied for the discovery that we have at Qubbat al-Hawa. We have a discovery that looks like it was an embalmer's cache. So if we're able to identify the contents of what was in the pot, we're able to identify some of the chemicals that were used for embalming at that time. Pots that are thousands of years old can give us such information.
So this will bring us to what we used to study and give it to my students in the Faculty of Medicine about the dental records of the ancient Egyptians, because the Egyptians were divided, if we can use this very general division, between the rich people and the poor people. And the poor people are the poor people who are grinding or eating on their grinders, which are the molars, and they are eating sort of corn and maize and all this stuff, while the rich people are having they can afford to eat more delicacies of life, and they will never, of course, wash their teeth with a toothpaste, so they are more developing dental caries when they're drinking wine or beer or things like that. So it's easily, when you're scanning two different skulls of different ages, first of all, you'll notice that the rich person would have lived more years than the poor. And the second point is that the rich man is usually having dental caries, whether he is Ramses II, who has a lot of dental caries because he was 91 years old, or was it because it's simply a rich nobleman who's having dental caries, while his counterpart, the same age, might have good teeth but really grounded. So how that matches with your discovery that people were actually cooking 5,000 years. So this means that the poor people were not just eating or grinding on seeds. The nature of the food that they were eating, has it changed, or it's the same policy? The same theory, I mean.
One of the main reasons that pottery probably was invented is that they wanted to cook cereals, seeds, because they're different from meat, which can just be grilled. Seeds have to be boiled, and this is why they needed a pot. And this is probably one of the reasons that people in general, human beings in general, invented such a pot, that it's something that can be put on fire without breaking. It can hold water, and hence will be used for cooking seeds which they want to eat. And this came with agriculture. This is why pottery is something that is always thought of attached with the Neolithic period. That's the period in which human beings started agriculture. Of course, human beings started using pottery shortly before that, in the time period before it. But because with agriculture, they had a lot of cereal crops, different from before when they were hunting and gathering, they could eat a lot of meat. They badly needed those pots. And this is why they came up with the idea.
So they, as we have thought in the beginning, right? They might eat more softer diet or more blended diet, right?
Exactly.
That's very interesting, because after the break we have more to talk about, especially the northern boundaries of Egypt, right?
Right.
So back again, word of info with us today, our distinguished guest, Dr. Martin Bomas, reader in Egyptology at University of Birmingham and curator of Ethan Myers collection, director of Qubbat al-Hawa Research Project and editor of the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, and Dr. Iman Khalifa, lecturer of Egyptology and Egyptologist at Cairo University.
Find myself at your door, just like all those times before. I'm not sure how I got there. All roads, they lead me here. I imagine you are home, in your room, all alone, and you open your eyes into mine, and everything feels better. Right before your eyes, I'm breaking. No pause, no reasons why, just you and me. This is the last time I'm asking you this. Put my name at the top of your list. This is the last time I'm asking you why. You break my heart in the blink of an eye. You find yourself at my door, just like all those times before. You wear your best apology, but I was there to watch you leave, and all the times I let you in, just for you to go again, disappear when you come back. Everything is better right before your eyes. I'm making fast, nowhere to hide, just you and me. This is the last time I'm asking you this. Put my name at the top of your list. This is the last time I'm asking you why. You break my heart in the blink of an eye. This is the last time you tell me I've got it wrong. This is the last time I say it's been you all along. This is the last time I let you in my door. This is the last time I won't hurt you anymore. This is the last time I'm asking you this. Put my name at the top of your list. This is the last time I'm asking This is the last time I'm asking you, last time I'm asking you, last time I'm asking you this.
So back again, word of info, and we had a question before we just move.
Yes.
And the question was
from Mr. Omar,
yes, and he was asking about mathematical measurements. Were there any a mathematical system that was
Were there any blueprints for somebody to build like a
and
structure
another,
like,
this is another question.
Yes,
we have
like
two questions.
a big or huge statue, or the Abu Simbel temple, which is so magnificent
Ramses.
prints, and how can he really transfer these blueprints into these magnificent structures?
Well, this is a very clever question, a very smart question, a question that the ancient Greeks already asked themselves: how did the Egyptians manage? Well, the ancient Egyptians very cleverly came up with a kind of proportions program. They thought in certain entities like cubits. One cubit is 52 centimeters, and they kind of build a proportion program that you can have on a very small scale, but you can enlarge it to kilometers if you want to. It just makes things bigger, and this is an ideal way to work on statues, small or big, or even a temple like Abu Simbel. For the ancient Egyptians, it does not matter. We need to be aware of that. Whether something is big or small, it is efficient nevertheless. Whether a pyramid is big or small does not change the value of a pyramid. And therefore the Egyptians were absolutely very good in decreasing or increasing objects. A model pot, we talked about pots before, is just as important as a big pot. It does not make any difference. So it was important for the Egyptians to develop a proportion canon very early during Egyptian culture, and the marble palette is perhaps the best example where such a canon of art exists. What you find on the marble palette, first floor, Egyptian Museum, the first object that you see when you get into that, what you find there defines Egyptian art, and they never ceased to deviate from this canon. What you have in Marble Palette holds true for Abu Simbel.
So when we look, for example, in the second floor, since we're talking about the Egyptian Museum, on the left side is the Middle Kingdom, and you see replicas of a very small houses with a lot of guards and a lot of people living, and people doing slaughtering of a sheep or a calf, and then you see people who are having a garden or things like that. So what they're doing exactly is doing sort of not a diagram but a model of everything that they want to do, and then they multiply this model with the number, and then they will have a magnificent structure or a very small petite, which is very accurate structure like the ones in the Middle Kingdom, right?
Absolutely. Because you see, in the Old Kingdom you do have these fantastic reliefs on the wall with all those scenes. But in the Middle Kingdom, they did not find them very fashionable. They did not decorate tombs as they did it in the Old Kingdom, but they had these tomb models, as we call them, instead. There you can move them around, you can put them on a sarcophagus, you can put them in a corner, wherever you want it. Gives them more flexibility, but they're accurate.
Very accurate. I mean,
in ancient Egypt, everything is about accuracy. The idea of l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake, does not exist. Art has an information. Whether we like it and we think ancient Egyptian art is beautiful or not, that does not matter for the ancient Egyptian. Art has a meaning. It conveys certain information. And this is what they were really good at.
So let's go to a hypothetical question, because they say that the work of art or the work of Egyptians is a work of believers. These are not slaves. They love what they're doing. So what is the place of love in this art? Was it just for money, or was it just for the satisfaction of their masters, or was there a sort of a relation between the artist and what he's doing? This is really important to understand the psyche. I mean, they were perfectionists. Are they just machines working, or they had certain emotional involvement with whatever they're manufacturing or drawing?
Well, first of all, the ancient Egyptians, like us today, they had to pay their bills. So they had to have proper jobs. And we know that at a child, at a very early age, if the child showed some skills, let's say in painting or so, were probably, spotted by a master. And then, when the child was taken to school, they tried to find out what his skills really are. Some child might have qualified for writing hieroglyphs. Another child might have been qualified for writing hieratic. Another one for paintings. Of course, you're always best in life at what you like the most. You're a psychologist. You probably can tell us more about that. If you do a job that you hate, you will never excel in it. You will never be good in it. So this is something the adults looked out for in a child. What are the skills of this child? What is he or she best at? And then they were used exactly for that. Of course, they were really very skilled people, but the ancient Egyptians would have not tolerated anything less. They just went for the best. But in terms of information, not in terms of style, what we regard as beautiful is not what the ancient Egyptians would have noted. They thought, well, that doesn't matter. It has the information. It tells us something.
But when you're looking, for example, into the very critical period of Tell Amarna, and you look at what Akhenaten did as a sort of what we call the revolution in art, and talking now in front of Iman, who looks exactly like Nefertiti. Everyone who knows her will know that she is a walking replica of Nefertiti, right?
I got that a lot when I was in Berlin.
Yes, of course. She's definitely, she's the living proof that she's one of the descendants of Nefertiti, and definitely a lovely lady, not only as in the looks, but definitely in the intellect. So when we talk about that, we look at how the statues were made and how the revolution was made in Tell Amarna. Now Akhenaten has decided to make this revolution, whether he wanted to do it for religious causes, whether he wanted to show the real life of the pharaoh, the intimacy of the love affair that he was having with his wife and his kids. So is this part as a sort of a revolution? You look at it as a revolution, or you simply look at it as a certain stage or a religious revolution?
Well, it's certainly an aesthetic revolution, but every pharaoh did that. Akhenaten is not really an exception here. His father, Amenhotep III, who kind of invented monumental art, did exactly the same. Look into statues of Hatshepsut, who had Senenmut as her advisor, who told her what the best temple would look like. So there were always thinkers. The ancient Egyptians did not just things as they happened, they were thinking very hard about certain things. And nowadays, when you're a tourist, you come to Egypt, every piece of Egyptian art almost looks the same. But not for the Egyptians and not for an Egyptologist. There's always change. There's continuity, but there's also change. And look at the 18th dynasty, because you mentioned Akhenaten. This change happens from the beginning of the 18th dynasty and is taken forward by Thutmose III, Amenhotep III. And
Thutmose had a great revolution. I mean, the kiosk that he's having in Karnak Temple is totally different than any structure before or after.
Absolutely, but look into Tutankhamun then again. That's the post-Amarna art, which goes back to a more traditional thinking, and that's a fantastic amalgamation of Amarna style and the old style and a new style. 3 styles in one. It cannot get more exciting.
And since you have mentioned Tutankhamun, what do you think of the beautiful throne? I mean, the lady putting her hands lovingly on the shoulders of the pharaoh, and both of them are sharing slippers. Don't you think that this is a very emotional moment that has been captured like a photograph?
Exactly.
Never miss a shot.
This is true. But this is exactly what Akhenaten had in mind. He was more going towards a natural understanding of our environment, and the nucleus of what society is the family. Everything starts and ends with a family, and therefore it's absolutely natural that he thought very hard about it. He thought, God gave us the animals, the environment, we just have to take care of it. But in the center of all is the family. So that makes sense to put that on the throne, because the center of kingship is a throne. The center of society is family.
Well, you are really, if I may use the expression, you're removing some beauty and making it more practical. Don't you think that this is a very pure scientific way of approach of art?
You're a charmer.
Well, after the break, we'll talk with Dr. Iman Khalifa, more about the northern borders of Egypt.
Yes.
Love sick, I got that fever. Love stupid, I know it. Love stupid, I know it. I know 'cause I'm a fool in love. My baby shot me down again. Shot me down with a love and it go bang bang. That girl's a killer from a gang. Shot me down with a love and it go bang bang. And oh, I love her so that's why I gotta let her know that I'll be here for her to always love her down. And baby, that's the truth, them clucking chickens ain't no use. I wanna wear my tux and see you in your gown.
Bang, bang, gotta make a bang. Love 'em down, down and shot my baby with a bang. Bang, gotta make a bang.
Bang, 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 bang.
Bang, gotta make a bang. Love 'em down, down and shot my baby with a bang. Bang, gotta make a bang.
Bang, 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 bang. I love her, can't leave her. Forever, I always need her. She lied, but I believe her. Love sick, I got that fever. Love stupid, I know it. Love stupid, I know it. I know 'cause I'm a fool in love. My baby shot me down, down, down. Shot me down with a love and it went pow, pow. Ow. I love my baby's freaky style. Freaky. But my baby's always sneaking out. Sneaky bitch. But damn, I love her so that's why I gotta let her know that I'll be here for her. I'll always be her man. And baby, that's the truth. You my chick, but a goose. I got that proof. I put that diamond on that hand.
Bang, bang, gotta make a bang. Love 'em down, down and shot my baby with a bang. Bang, gotta make a bang.
Bang, 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 bang.
Bang, gotta make a bang. Love 'em down, down and shot my baby with a bang. Bang, gotta make a bang.
Bang, 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 bang. Oh yeah, I love my baby. Hey baby, yeah, I love you. Stupid is what stupid do. Tom and Jerry and Scooby Doo. Oh baby, I'm a fool for you. Skibbity bip bip bippity bop. Come here, baby, be my lollipop. I make a beat and make a booty drop. Bippity bip bippity bip bippity bop. Hey baby, can't get you out my brains. Damn girl, you such a sexy thing. You a pretty little lady, and my baby makes me go down, down. And my baby makes me go down, down. Hey, my baby make me go down, down. My baby.
So back again, word of info.
So, talking about the northern borders, we talk about the southern borders with Dr. Bomas, and we are really interested to know, because some people think that the northern frontier or the northern borders of Egypt were just maybe in Alexandria, which of course was not present during the ancient Egyptian times, or was it really in El Arish or in the middle of Palestine, what's known now as Palestine, or is it simply, as you were telling me, it's almost at the apex of the delta?
All of the Eastern Delta developed significantly before the Western Delta because it was the border. At that time, Palestine, what is now Palestine, had some cultural centers there. And Egypt was trading with them, import and export, which mainly happened in the form of goods that came in pottery and pots. Wine or oil, it all came from Palestine and all came in pots. And this is why the Eastern Delta was developed before the Western Delta, relying on that. It was not only wine and olive oil. Recently, the Polish excavators discovered in an area called Tel el-Farha, a factory for beer.
Tel el-Farha, the translation is simply the chicken hill?
Exactly. Exactly. I don't know what kind of chicken it was, but that's the reason they have the borders there, and this is why, exactly like in Elephantine, it's an important area. And from the pre-dynastic period, they were they were exchanging goods with Palestine, which, as I said, came in the form of pots. And because they wanted to know what exactly was in each pot, because most of the time it was a sealed pot, especially if it was fermented, something like wine,
Wine, yes.
they needed to develop a writing system in order to identify what was in the pot and the quality and the quantity.
Wow.
And this
So
is
this
why
is how it started, the writing thing.
this is exactly how
For
writing
taxation,
system-
right?
Exactly,
So-
for taxation.
So
for-
as
for
the famous
anything.
advertisement say, taxes is for your own benefit, right?
Exactly.
You remember this advertisement?
I remember that.
So taxes is for your own benefit, and yes, actually taxes was the benefit for the Egyptians to learn and do the writings. So since we are talking about writings, I really was very it attracted my attention what you were saying about the German Egyptologists, how they since they were denied an access in the golden years of the 20th century to Egypt to work on archaeology, and I'm sure of that what happened in 1914 when the German expedition was sent back home due to the First World War, and during, of course, the turmoil years in the early 20s, and then in the 30s, they were never given the chance, although scholars like Ahmad Badawi, as I was telling you, had his PhD from there. So for glorious 40 years, they were not allowed in Egypt, but they perfected the understanding of the documents. Tell us about the documents, because in a final talk, I'm sorry we're running out of time, but we're talking about the documents or the reliefs. What's written in the papyrus is that the amount of papyrus that reached us are very fewer than actually what was there, because it was used in the 16th century for a lot of things other than like aphrodisiac or black magic or whatever. So the amount that reached us were really sufficient to give an idea for the German scholars about Egypt.
Well, it was. I mean, things were hampered, for example, by the fact that Tiberius, when he came to Egypt, loved to burn libraries because he liked the smell of burning papyrus.
Yes.
That doesn't really help a lot. But it's true that the Germans, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, started with a dictionary project, 5 volumes of a dictionary of ancient Egyptian language. No other area in ancient history, like Assyriology, has such a tool to hand like we have it since the 1940s. And there are many texts, of course, available to Egyptologists at that time, but now we've gained more texts. We now know the pyramid texts corpus, the first religious corpus of texts of mankind. We do have that to our advantage. We know more about religious texts, for instance. And of course, we have a better understanding of literary text as well. You know, texts and hieroglyphs is the entrance ticket into modern Egyptology. Of course, Egyptology moved on, like with the things that Dr. Iman does. But in order to be an Egyptologist, you have to be able to read Egyptian hieroglyphs to understand the culture. You are not able to understand the culture if you do not understand the language. Only people like Dr. Iman does that. She does not have language in pre-dynastic, studies, but she does it in another way. Okay, that's the way it works.
So how long did it take you to learn hieroglyphics?
I was able to read it on a very badly level after 2 years. But then, because I wasn't really good, I went to Leiden University, which then was the best place in the world to study hieroglyphs, and I stayed there for a year. And after that, I was quite okay. Now I'm teaching hieroglyphs in Birmingham.
But does it have vowels, or you just know vowels?
It's like Arabic. We don't really know how it was pronounced. We're making it up. For instance, a word that consists of SDM, we pronounce it as SEDM. We're at ease in order to make it sound. Otherwise, we would sound like no one would understand that. But internationally, we have agreed on a certain way of transcribing it, with the Japanese use as much as the Chinese, as the Germans. Everyone works from the same system.
So you
That
can
helps.
talk hieroglyphics, actually?
We could, but why would we?
Well, that's an interesting question. Why wouldn't we? And this would be the topic of our next discussion with you, sir. If you may allow us next time, you promised both of you to come again and again in our program to give the listeners a glimpse of ancient Egypt, because definitely we as listeners and we as Egyptians have to know more about history.
Yes.
So
Yes, and by this we come to the end of World of Info. Today we had Dr. Martin Bomas, reader in Egyptology at University of Birmingham, curator of Eaton Myers Collection, director of Qubbat al-Hawad Research Project, and the editor of the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, and Dr. Iman Khalifa, a lecturer of Egyptology at Cairo University and Egyptologist, and Dr. Amrou Mabrouk, professor of plastic surgery at Ain Shams University, Dua Muhammad at the controls. I'm Najla Naguib. See you next Thursday, same time, same station, FM 95.4.
Loving him is like driving a new Maserati down a dead-end street. Faster than the wind, passionate as sin, ending so suddenly. Loving him is like trying to
You're locked in to the number one radio station. Number one.
Number one.
Number one, baby.
Number one.
The bomb.
Number one. Keep listening, and we'll remain number one.
95.4 Cairo.